Good morning. I'm Justin Chang, film critic at the Los Angeles Times, and I do welcome you to week 13 and this special Thursday morning transatlantic edition of the Ultimate Summer Movie Showdown, the LA Times series where our readers get to choose the greatest summer movies of all time. With theaters closed and major Hollywood releases being held back due to the COVID-19 pandemic, my Times colleagues and I asked ourselves, what if instead of having the worst summer movie season ever, we engaged with our readers and came up with the ultimate summer movie season? And that's what we've been doing. Here's how it works. For 16 weeks, we are compiling some of the best, most memorable big movies from each week of release since 1975, the summer of Jaws. And we are letting you vote for your favorites in a series of head-to-head contests posted on my Twitter account at Justin C. Chang. This week, you voted, and you chose Mission Impossible Fallout, the sixth entry in the enormously successful series of films starring Tom Cruise as IMF agent Ethan Hunt, inspired by the classic Mission Impossible TV spy series that ran from 1966 to 73 and from 1988 to 1990. The franchise has grossed more than $3.5 billion worldwide over 6 films and 24 years and is still going strong. Anchored by Tom Cruise and a revolving ensemble that has included actors like Ving Rhames, Simon Pegg, Michelle Monaghan, and Jeremy Renner, the series has passed through the hands of multiple directors, including Brian De Palma, John Woo, J.J. Abrams, and Brad Bird. And that brings us to our guest today, Christopher McQuarrie, the writer-director of Mission Impossible Fallout, as well as the preceding 5th entry in the series, Mission Impossible Rogue Nation. He also directed The Way of the Gun and Jack Reacher, both of which he also wrote, and he's written or co-written numerous movies, including Edge of Tomorrow and Valkyrie. He won the Academy Award and many other honors for his original screenplay for the 1995 thriller The Usual Suspects. He's the only filmmaker to have directed multiple Mission Impossible films and is presently preparing to resume production on the 7th film, which makes us all the more grateful and excited to have him join us today from the UK. So, Christopher McQuarrie, welcome to the Ultimate Summer Movie Showdown, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
Most of the filmmakers I've spoken with during this whole series are, hunkering down at home, many of them LA, some working on films, some taking breaks. I know you've had a more eventful time of it. How is it going right now? How are you doing?
It's going really well. I mean, we have a saying on this franchise that disaster is an opportunity to excel. So anytime we run into any sort of setback, we immediately look for ways that we can improve based on whatever time that setback affords us. So the day we were in Venice, 2 days away from principal photography, when the city was evacuated and the pandemic started in Europe. And within 72 hours, we had developed a new plan in terms of keeping pre-production going and keeping people employed and keeping the studio moving as much as we could.
Yeah, I know that making one of these films often feels like an impossible mission, even under the best circumstances. And this is sort of, ratcheted up the stakes even further. But, we've heard so much, I know that, is it true that you've taken over an old military base in the UK and everyone's, practicing strict distancing, which I know is challenging when you're making an action film. Tell us about some of that.
You have to put in place protocols so that the crew is working in smaller groups, so that if someone gets sick, they've only been working with a smaller group of people. They haven't been interacting with everybody on the crew, so that if somebody shows symptoms, they can be taken out and not have to isolate the entire crew. I unfortunately do not have our health officer on with me who could tell you in exhaustive and painstakingly boring detail all the many ins and outs. But it's masks on set, it's social distancing, there's frequent hand washing, frequent COVID testing. Everybody has their temperature checked before they come in, and contact tracing. There's a constant understanding of who people are interacting with, so that if anybody gets sick, we know immediately who that person was in contact with and can isolate anybody that may have been affected. And we've been very fortunate so far.
sounds like a marvel of efficiency we envy over here in the States. I know you must feel a little bit safer over there. And I know as conditions have improved, like in Italy and elsewhere throughout Europe, are things looking up? Are you hoping that you might be able to resume, like what the interrupted shoot in Venice, for example, or other, just going back to kind of the schedule you had in mind, or have you had to sort of?
It would be a completely different schedule based not so much on the pandemic, but just based on logistics, time of year. Starting at a different time of year than we were starting before. Some of the sequences have changed, and the preparation that goes into one sequence has shifted. So it rearranged the order in which we were going to shoot things, but it didn't really change what we were going to shoot. And we're hoping to resume shooting sometime very soon. I'm not saying when, but sometime very soon. I'm only not saying when because my fingers are crossed.
Right. Yeah.
I don't want to jinx it.
No, you don't need any more challenges at this point, even if I know you thrive on it. These movies do thrive on disaster. And I understand that a lot of
we thrive on it. We do not court it.
You don't need to. It'll come to you quite naturally.
It'll come to you. Yeah.
Well, and this is that's maybe a good segue for something I have to ask about. I know that there have been reports of the film shoot involving this 11-year-old bridge in the Polish village of Pielhowice. I ask this because I've been flooded with messages from Twitter users in Poland who are, upset about the possibility of this bridge being possibly destroyed or damaged. I know there's more to the matter, and I know you may not be able to speak to all of it, but what is your present response to these concerns?
As a matter of fact, probably about an hour before this interview started, my response went live on social media and Empire Magazine, and it's I go into pretty exhaustive detail, probably more exhaustive detail than you want to hear here.
Sure.
But the headline was, there was never a plan for us to demolish a 111-year-old protected monument. That was not the case. And when you read the article, you'll see that what Mission Impossible does, we do not start with story or action. We start with locations. We let the locations tell us what the story is. And we'll come up with rough concepts. And in the case of this sequence that we were talking about, very early on in pre-production, there was a rough concept of a sequence involving a bridge, and a bridge that would be partially demolished. We didn't really believe that such a thing was possible, but you ask a lot of funny questions in this line of work, and we put out feelers globally, asking people in every territory we could think of, particularly territories we hadn't already shot in, if they had a bridge that they wanted to get rid of. And that is where the conversation started. You'll see when you read the statement, everything that happened and how the conversation became, it took on a life of its own, became politicized, and a lot of misinformation was published about it. And of course, it makes for a good story. We're accustomed to that. We're accustomed to that kind of noise, where the speculation is a lot more exciting than the boring answer. And so what I did was gave everybody the 3-page boring answer of what happened. And you'll see it's not a particularly sexy headline, unfortunately. Normally we ignore it, but sure. What was very clear is that it really upset a lot of people in Poland. It was less of an issue outside of Poland than it was inside of Poland, and we wanted to set the record straight. It's not an appeal of any kind. It's not a defense of anything. Sure. We just thought it was really important that people understood that we actually really do take enormous care with the locations that we go to, the historical monuments that we do feature in our movies, and so we just wanted everybody to know that there was no disrespect intended, because the story, as I said, had just sort of taken on a life of its own.
Sure. Thanks for clarifying that. I look forward to reading the statement, and I'm sure many...
You don't, it's really boring, but...
I'll take a look.
I don't know. You might find it interesting. There's a little twist in the story. That's kind of,
Okay.
but it's if anything, it is it's a peek behind the curtain of how we do these things. When we go into an area and start talking about an action sequence like that, and you're shooting something through populated areas, through crowded, congested cities, past monuments. If you look at Fallout, I mean, the places that we were allowed access to in Paris, the negotiations that go into ensuring that everything will be protected is a very long process, and it always involves a very careful negotiation so that everybody understands how we do things, why we do it. And we also understand that when we come to a new city, we don't expect people to trust us. What we have learned over time is we'll start to shoot the sequence as we are trying to secure other locations. And and what tends to happen is they start to realize how serious we are, how careful we are, how focused we are on not only featuring those monuments, but celebrating the culture, celebrating the place that we are. We want to showcase these locations that we go to. We want people to watch our movie and want to go to those places. And so it's always a little bit of a dance. It's always a little bit of earning people's trust. And we understand that. And not only do we take it quite seriously, but we're very patient about it too.
It's good to know. I mean, absolutely, what you say, the pleasures of the globe-trotting adventures of these movies is innate to their appeal. And it's a good segue to Fallout as well, because I understand that a lot of MI7 may be shot in Norway, which is where that stunning third act of Fallout was shot. And just can you talk about just returning there? Did you fall in love with that location? I mean, I certainly did watching it in Fallout, but it's easy to see why. But yeah.
We did. Well, we absolutely did. The interesting thing is that the first rule when we talk about Mission Impossible, meaning the ones I've worked on, where has Mission not been?
Right.
Where is Bond currently not? We don't want to be shooting in the same place that James Bond is. And where is it safe to go? Where are places in the world where we can actually take a production and guarantee their safety and security? And it's interesting how that changes from movie to movie, and it's interesting how quickly that eliminates parts of the world. That Venn diagram gets very specific and very small very quickly. Norway was a very late addition to Fallout. We were shooting in New Zealand, and we needed a specific piece of topography that New Zealand simply didn't have. We needed a sheer straight drop that was a very dramatic straight drop, which you saw at the end of the film at a place called Preikestolen in. I know I'm saying that wrong, and I apologize to anybody who speaks Norwegian. It's also called Pulpit Rock, which is probably what I should have just said. And Pulpit Rock was a perfect example of what I was presenting to our location coordinator as the kind of topography we needed. The trick then became, how do you take parts of New Zealand, parts of London, and parts of Norway and merge all of them so that they can all feel like they're in the same location, and in this case, a location that we're calling Kashmir. And the only reason that the movie is featured in Kashmir is because New Zealand didn't feel like a particularly politically tense place, and there's a lot of political tension in Kashmir, which we didn't really address in the movie. We didn't want to make the movie political, but Kashmir felt in some ways more exotic and more like where major events would be happening, given what the villains of the movie were up to. So all of you, so we don't start out saying the third act of the movie takes place in Kashmir. At least I don't. I start by looking at the topography that I have and the things that I need over the course of the sequence as it's developing, and then start to step back from it, look at it dramatically, and say, okay, what is this? So we didn't really settle on it being Kashmir until after we had chosen New Zealand and started looking at Norway. So, of course, anybody who knows anything about the topography of those regions finds it kind of absurd that you're 1 minute you're in New Zealand, you fall out of a helicopter into Norway, and there are shots that are in London in between, and never set foot in Kashmir, and you're calling it
Right.
Kashmir. Yes.
To this layperson's eyes, it looks remarkably seamless, of course. So, which is, but what you say is, the way location drives action and the way action sometimes drives narrative. I mean, it's such a balancing act that you've pulled off so well. And you're the first filmmaker to both write and direct a Mission Impossible movie, and you're the first one to write and direct multiple Mission Impossible movies. It gives these two movies, and presumably the next two that you're working on back to back, this remarkable narrative continuity that the previous movies, which were pretty self-enclosed adventures, did not. I mean, I know that you didn't plan this from the beginning, but was that part of the appeal of saying yes to Fallout in particular, and now saying yes to these next two? I mean, the ability to do a more serialized kind of feature narrative, I mean, and giving Ethan Hunt.
Funny enough, I mean, I never even set out to be an action director. When I hear myself referred to as an action director, I find that strange. I find that kind of alien. I think John McTiernan is an action director, and I think it was never anything I was really in pursuit of, and it was not the kind of movies that I set out to make. I learned probably around the time that I first started working with Tom, that it was easier to go through the door that opened. I had been trying to push my career in a certain direction and determine the kind of filmmaker I wanted to be. And looking back on that, I realized that was a big mistake, that you are the filmmaker that you are, regardless of the kind of movies that you're making. You can't help but have your DNA in that. It's taken me years of making movies to recognize that, and not to look at other filmmakers and what they do and say, how do they do that? Well, they do that because they're them. And they do that because that's who they are. That's their taste, their sensibility, a million other factors that are influencing what it is they're doing. I simply responded to the stories that I was being offered after I started working with Tom. The first one was Jack Reacher, which Tom wasn't at the time even supposed to star in. Jack Reacher, again, was the kind of movie I didn't really think I would do. It's not anything that I was pursuing. Reacher then led to Edge of Tomorrow, where I was working as a writer, having just come off of Jack Reacher. And while we were working on Jack Reacher, Tom, he noticed the work that I was doing. And I think at that point, he noticed my understanding of the scale of the movie, that it didn't matter if I was making a smaller movie like Reacher or a bigger movie like Edge. And he said, you should direct the next Mission Impossible. It wasn't really I don't really remember having much of a conversation about it beyond, hey, you should do this. And the next thing I knew, I was doing that. So when Rogue ended, I immediately tried to go back to the things that I wanted to do. I thought, coming off of Rogue Nation, well, now they'll let me do the things that I want to do. And the truth is they didn't, because not only do they not want to make the movies that I naturally gravitate to for their own sake, I don't think that they perceive me as a filmmaker who makes those movies. They perceive me as a filmmaker who makes these other kind of movies. And it's a very delicate dance. So it has a lot to do with perception. It has a lot to do with comfort level. And the truth of the matter is that it's easier for me to go with the tide, to go in the direction that when you're on a movie like Mission Impossible, people have already decided to make that movie. I'm not having to convince them of making that, and that's half the battle. The tremendous amount of effort that goes into convincing people to make movies that they're not naturally inclined to make. I've just simply never had success at it. I keep trying. Don't get me wrong. I do it every single time, and I don't. Again, when I look at other filmmakers and say, "How does he do that?" I don't know how Wes Anderson gets his movies made. I don't know how David O. Russell gets his movies made, or David Fincher, because anytime I bring a movie like that to a studio, there's, there aren't enough things blowing up in it, I guess. So that's something they don't want to do. But I've had this problem going all the way back to Usual Suspects. When I made my name making that movie and wanted to make the transition into directing, I didn't want to do another twist-heavy crime film, dialogue-heavy crime film. I wanted to do other kinds of drama. No one would let me do anything except make another crime film. And that's what led to my making The Way of the Gun, which I made in all consciousness. I made that saying, I'm going to make a crime film in a way nobody's going to ask me to make one again. And then I was surprised that they didn't.
It's like, it reminds me of that saying of, directors who, one for me, one for them. And I know that's not easier said than done. And
well, you got to start with one for them. To get that engine going, it's one for them. You've got to make a small movie that makes a lot of money, and that was not my path. I'm now on a path I'm very comfortable with and very happy with. And look, I'm delighted to be able to do the things that I do, and the enormous freedom that I have within that box. The things that the themes I'm allowed to explore, the technology that I'm allowed to play with, and sometimes it's technology that we're inventing. We're doing things that people have never done before. The stories that I'm drawn to are not stories that this current marketplace really has a place for. I don't mean to sound fatalistic. I'm not one of those people who's saying, I was reading some article and somebody was saying that independent films are dead. The independent film market is over, et cetera, et cetera. I don't believe any of that. I think that movies will always be there in some form. I certainly hope that there will always be a place where you can go and watch a movie with 400 strangers. That's a very different experience than watching the movie at home. Anyway,
No, it's so on my mind and all our minds right now, as with theaters closed in the US anyways. I know they may be reopening in some fashion throughout the world, but just what this does for big event movies like Mission Impossible, which which I very much look forward to and hope whenever we can safely see them. But hope streaming is certainly not my ideal for viewing anything, but hopeful that there's still life in independent films and international films as well, that we can.
I think there is. I think there will
sure.
be. Look, here's what it comes down to. I was asked this recently, talking about studios and studios not wanting to make original films. Studios do want original content. They struggle to find the bandwidth, at least in my observation. They struggle to find the bandwidth for original content. Look at what a studio has to do now to exist in this marketplace. They have to generate franchises. Movies are enormous risks. It doesn't matter what size the movie is. The marketing that goes into making a small movie is just as big as the marketing that goes into a big movie. So you might as well go big. The mechanism has kind of taken on a life of its own. And so studios are so busy looking for solutions to pre-existing problems. It's not that they have a lot of freedom for original content like that. and so you can feel that. You can feel that struggle. You can feel that frustration. It's not that the studios are saying this is the only thing we're interested in. This is all the only thing people want. It's become the tail that wags the dog that they're trying to manage and wrestle with. And everything that's going on with the pandemic has only made that more and more complicated. But I ultimately think enough people enjoy the experience of going to the movies. The harder thing is that when we grew up, I don't know how old you are, I grew up going to the movies, and where if you wanted to see a kind of movie, you had to go to the movies. That when you wanted to see that movie at home, you had to wait a long time until that movie came out on television, and then eventually came out on VCR. I remember before there were VCRs, dating myself. So I have a different emotional attachment to the experience of going to movies than my children's friends do. My children enjoy it, kind of, because I encouraged it and we went. But they don't have the same emotional connection to the act of going to the theater. That doesn't mean they don't like good narrative. It doesn't mean that I don't see younger people enjoying black and white movies when they're correctly introduced to them. It's a little bit alien to them. It's the same way that I would probably have looked at silent films when I was that age.
Right.
They're not raised on it as the primary means with which to see cinema. And so their emotional connection, at least as I'm observing it, is a much different one than this generation.
Right.
That's the thing that makes me the most nervous, is not that theaters aren't open and that it's going to be hard to go, or that people are going to be afraid to go. It's a disconnection from that emotional experience of the social experience of watching movies and its association with part of the experience. Sitting in a dark theater on opening night, the lights going down, that's mom's home cooking to me. I mean, there is an emotional reaction to that experience that I cherish, that a generation of people don't find all that important. And what happens is we look at that very cynically and say, oh, people under a certain age, they don't like movies. You hear it all the time where they say, people under 25, they have short attention span and they're not interested in complex narrative, and you have to dazzle them and you have to dynamite them out of their house. That's bullshit. They're at home watching 12-hour narrative. They're consuming whole seasons of television over the course of a weekend, which are very complex narratives, darker and more sophisticated narratives than anything that you can find in theater. They love complex narrative. The movie theater is not what's giving it to them. The other problem that's happening is I'm limited by at a certain budget, I am limited by a specific rating. The makers of Game of Thrones are not limited to that. They can do whatever they want. And so a younger audience, which wants more sophisticated, more dangerous fare, are staying at home watching what would be NC-17 if I made it in a feature film. So there's this very odd disconnect that I see happening, where studios are working really hard to get that younger audience to come and engage them. But there are limitations on the kind of films that they can provide them that can't compete with the things that they see at home. The audience is much more sophisticated than they are given credit for. And all anybody is looking at is the bottom line and assuming that the opposite is true.
Yeah. The limitations are different indeed. And I mean, you're obviously limited in terms of the longevity and the complexity of narrative you can do in a theater, but you also have, the properties of cinema, which are what really, I think, have certainly distinguished Mission Impossible. And, for a finite amount of time, you provide this visual experience that is, I say this as someone who devoured Game of Thrones and also wished I'd seen, quite a few of those episodes in the theater. But I want to talk about your visual style with Mission Impossible. You know, watching the two movies back to back, they're beautifully shot by the great Robert Elswit, and I'm struck by just the discipline and just the classicism of your filmmaking, and not just in action scenes, in dialogue scenes. You have long takes. You have not a lot of busy editing, and you know you clearly put a lot of care into holding the audience's attention. Why is that? You talk about just why that clarity is so important to you, and it's different too from some of the the earlier films in this series, which are beautifully shot in their own way too, but maybe with a bit more flamboyance or busyness or whatnot. Yeah.
You're seeing the kind of movies that I want to make merged with the kind of movies that I'm invited to make. And you're looking at my and Tom Cruise's respect for visual storytelling, character and emotion as the primary supports of story. Spectacle is secondary to that. Um, we're what you're seeing is respect for the audience. I I come from a place of understanding and believing that an audience is much more sophisticated than anyone gives them credit for and does not need to be assaulted, and in fact gets worn out by that assault.
Right.
All I really focus on is clarity and geography when I'm directing action. What I want is for you to understand what's going on. Here, what it really comes down to, and I see this quite a lot. Um, there are movies that are made for you, and there are movies that are made with you. You cannot make a film without the active participation of the audience. Anybody who's watching my film is making the movie because they are trying to anticipate where the story is going. They're questioning and interrogating the narrative, and they have this dangerous indifference because they didn't make the movie. At any moment, I could lose your attention. More attention is not the word. I can lose your engagement. All I really care about, instant to instant throughout the movie, is your engagement in the narrative. Um, what I see happen a lot is filmmakers with the best of intentions trust the screenplay or the actors to tell the story. They give the actors lines of dialogue that convey emotional ideas that and then they ask the audience to internalize those emotional ideas and convert them into emotion. That's not what I do as a filmmaker. What I do as a filmmaker is I present you with a series of impulses designed to create a certain emotional response. You're not actually expected to do anything. I'm not asking you to put two and two together and turn it into some sort of an emotion. The math I want you doing is trying to guess where the story is going. I don't want you guessing how the story is supposed to feel. And between Rogue and Fallout, there was an exponential leap for me from the understanding that information was actually not a storytelling device, but it's actually a storytelling necessity. It's a necessary evil that I'm doing everything I can to eliminate. Information is the death of emotion. What I want you doing is responding to the movie on an emotional level. I want you feeling it rather than trying to track it or add it up or having to listen to the dialogue with the actors telling you why things are important. If I frame the shot correctly and I edit the scene correctly, if I'm in sync with the actors and I present the actors with the frame that conveys that emotion, all the actor has to do is step into that frame and feel it rather than convey it. I'm absolving them of the responsibility of telling the story, and I'm creating an environment when they can just experience the story. And ideally, when you're making a truly subjective movie, the audience is experiencing what the main character is. That's what is Ethan Hunt. I mean, that's what Tom and I focus on with Ethan. Point of view is an extremely important priority to us, which in a lot of films it gets lost, it gets dispersed, and it's very hard to do. It's an art form when you're dealing with ensemble casts and things like that. That's why I'm so amazed at the emotionality that I find in something like a Marvel movie, because you have so many characters and so many narratives. How do you make all of those narratives emotional when point of view, a character's point of view, is not carrying you through the whole journey? I thought what Endgame did that was so extraordinary, what they focused on, and I thought was great. Endgame did not bother themselves with the logic of time travel. What they focused on was, how does time travel impact these characters? And they created these small vignettes, and you watched as all these characters confronted their past. You didn't need lots and lots of screen time to do that. What you needed was a real sense of emotional context and point of view, and they took real care to knowing when to focus on characters' points of view. If you go back and watch those movies, you'll see that it's something that they understand really, really well. And when you find yourself disconnected from a movie, more often than not, the reason why you are disconnected is because you're not in the character's experience. You are watching that character have an experience. That doesn't mean that it's not a great story. It's just not as immersive as subjective point of view, and we obsess about it. People think we obsess about the stunts and all of the showing off and all of that. That's the contract we've signed with you. That's the stuff we owe you when you show up to Mission Impossible. It's a big tentpole movie, and we're doing things that nobody else can do because we have a star who can do them. That's actually not the stuff that we worry about. The stuff that we worry about the most is, do I care about this character? Do I feel stakes in this situation? Am I invested in this journey? And the number of times Tom Cruise will come to me in a movie and say, are we hooked into Ethan enough? And those are the words he used. Are we hooked in? Mm-hmm. Am I hooked into this character's journey? What is he feeling in this scene? And how do we make the audience feel it? That's the stuff that we're most focused
on. Just really quickly, because it's funny you mentioned Endgame, I think they have a lot of fun with it too. Like the mechanics of time travel don't even matter. We can even make fun of them a little bit and reference all the history of time travel in movies. And I feel like there's some equivalent playfulness in Rogue Nation, especially Fallout. You sort of inundate us with a lot of narrative information at the beginning, and it's almost like, don't worry, don't sweat the small stuff. It's like, let it wash over you. And it's great to hear you talk about just the difference between those two movies too, because rewatching them both back to back recently, it feels like with Rogue Nation, you're setting up this very intricate Swiss watch mechanism with the syndicate and introducing all the players. It's a very tense, intricate buildup. And then with Fallout, as the title suggests, there's this enormous, like, kind of exhilarating release and payoff on all that. I mean, yes. I know, again, it's just they're really great pieces.
Rogue Nation started as a movie where we believed there were rules to the action movie. The A400 sequence at the beginning of the film, we didn't know where it went in the movie when we shot it. We were debating constantly back and forth whether that was the opening of the film, whether it was the kickoff to the end of the big action sequence at the end of the movie, or whether it was a postscript. That after the story ended, that was the kickoff to another Mission Impossible. We played with all of those ideas, and even in the editing, we tried some of that. We were struggling. We just could not figure out the ending of the movie. It never felt right. It never felt organic. They were always outrageously expensive because doing a third act climax means keeping all the characters involved in a way that you don't have to do in the opening. And I went to see Tom one night, and I said, I think the problem is that we're trying to make a sequence where you fight the villain and kill him. And I don't have some abiding need for that to happen in this movie. I'm not feeling a desire. That won't feel satisfying to me. Because the movies become about you and Ilsa. It's not really about you and Solomon Lane, which is what we set out to do. We set out to create this rivalry between these two characters, and Lane more and more became the reason things were happening instead of the objective of the story. And Tom said, you're right, what do we do if we don't have this big confrontation at the end? And I said, well, you were trapped in a glass box at the beginning of the movie. We'd already shot that opening. said, it seems only right that you catch him in a glass box at the end. And the movie went from going like this, just spreading out exponentially, to suddenly focusing down on this very small point. And if you watch the end of Rogue Nation, it's not spectacle. There isn't the third act that you expect from a Mission Impossible movie. But we're doing what the story is telling us to do. We're going with the story and obeying it and going after a satisfying emotional conclusion. People at that point in the movie didn't need another big action sequence. They wanted to know what was going to happen to these characters and how was this all going to work out? How are things going to be made right? And when the studio watched the movie, after we tested it tested very, very well. And that's kind of their holy grail. They were all very relieved, and I sat down with the head of the studio and said, now admit it, if I'd handed you a script that ended with, catching the villain in a box made out of some spare parts from Home Depot, you would never agree with this movie. And he said, absolutely not. We never would have. So the rules of spectacular filmmaking and big budget filmmaking supersede the rules of story. And Mission Impossible does not set out with a story. Mission Impossible sets out with a general sense of tone and character. And we go to Paris and say, what is Paris telling us to do? What kind of sequence does Paris want? And Paris felt like a chase. We knew we wanted to do a helicopter chase. Well, where in the world can you do that? Well, the only place that would let us do it was New Zealand. So we now know that either the middle of the movie or the end of the movie is taking place in New Zealand. We're not going to put that big sequence as the beginning because the movie's never going to be able to overcome it. And we also knew we wanted to do the opposite of Rogue. We wanted to end on the biggest note possible so that we weren't repeating ourselves. And everything comes together organically after that. Now, there are scenes in the movie that work very, very hard to explain logically everything that's happening. When Henry Cavill goes in to see Sean Harris, they have a much longer scene, and the entire movie is made clear to you. It's all explained to you. Nobody in the audience cared. The test audiences they were bored by the information. Information being the death of emotion. They knew what was coming, and they didn't care about the reasons. And the lesson we've learned going into 7 and 8, reasons come last. Start with the emotion of what it is you want, the tone of what you want, and the feelings that you want the audience to feel. I have very specific ideas of what I want, to the kind of movie I want to bring this time. And actually, it's 2 movies, and each movie is different. The relationships of the characters in the movie and how Rogue was a discovery of an emotional spark in the movie between Ethan and Ilsa that we didn't really know we had until we were watching the edited film. Yeah. Fallout was taking that emotional idea and giving Ethan a more emotional arc throughout the story, with Tom wanting to resolve the story of Julia because people were still asking him about it. And he doesn't like leaving you with an unsatisfying unresolved. That's not to say, oh, we've got to give them what they want, because Tom is just as quick to say, sometimes they want what they want until you give it to them. And it's never about giving you what you ask for, it's giving you what you want. And sometimes you're asking for what you want, and sometimes you're asking for what you don't. So coming out of Fallout, I said, I want to take that now, and I want to apply that to every character in the story. Now, when we do that, when we give an emotional arc to all of them, the length of the movie is going to expand. Because as we were talking about earlier, Game of Thrones can have a narrative play out over 8, 10, 12 episodes. We have 120 minutes, and Fallout is 2 hours and 20 minutes long because of all of the character drama in the story that's there to support the action. I said, if we're going to add emotional arcs for every character in the story, the movie is now at 3 hours, 3.5 hours, even longer. Let's just call it 4 and break it in 2 and make a bigger movie. And that's what we presented to the studio. We didn't. It was never a cynical cash grab. It was never a thing about, oh, we're going to make 2 movies for the price of 1. Believe me, we're not. It was simply a matter of, I can't fit as emotionally satisfying a narrative as Fallout, however satisfying you may or may not find it, into a 2-hour movie because of the time I need to let characters breathe and let stories develop. And we did not know when we started out where one movie ended and the other movie began. We just knew we need the space. We know that as soon as we start to add certain elements to character stories, that the movie's just going to expand. And I don't want to be worrying about that. I don't want to be sweating. How am I going to get out of this scene in 2 pages instead of 7? Because my movie needs to be 120 minutes long.
Right.
At the same time, we recognized that the way Mission Impossibles work, they work in 20-minute chapters. You say Vienna Opera House, I know it's 20 minutes. You say helicopter chase in Kashmir, I know it's 20 minutes. No matter how short I may lie to myself, oh, that scene's going to be 8 minutes long and we're going to be out. It's 20 minutes. The setup, the payoff, everything else. So we then realized, we took all of our big ideas and said, you can have 6. You can have 6. And I don't care which 6 you pick. This is what you can have. We'll put them together in an order and then ask ourselves, why are the characters on this journey? And most importantly, in the opening of this movie, it was identifying for the audience, where is the team emotionally in the first instant of the film? How do you convey that the way we conveyed it in Fallout? And that was really the big breakthrough in Fallout, was starting with that dream, putting the audience in his head. That was dictated by the necessity to reintroduce Julia as a character. We weren't asking the audience to remember 2 Mission Impossibles ago. We were 3 Mission Impossibles ago. We were asking the audience to be there in the narrative. You don't ever need to have seen any of the previous Mission Impossibles to follow Fallout. We don't do fan service. And the reason why we don't do that is it's not narrative storytelling.
Yeah. I'm glad that, we'll see more of Ilsa, because, she's one of the few female, maybe the only co-lead in this franchise who's had a really sustained arc over more than 1 movie. And I just have to say, Rebecca Ferguson is really terrific in the role. And she's I think, obviously Rogue Nation put her on the movie map in a big way. Just talk about just finding Rebecca and casting her, because she's, I think she's fantastic in the films. Yeah.
Rebecca is, she is lightning in a bottle. It was an absolute miracle. What happened was, I had another idea for the actor that I wanted to cast in that role. And I went to the studio. The first thing I did at the beginning of Rogue Nation was I went to Paramount Marketing, because I had really struggled with marketing on Jack Reacher. And so I went to Paramount Marketing and said, tell me what you need from me. Tell me how to make a Mission Impossible movie from your point of view. And they were a little bit stunned. No director had ever come to them on that footing. And they were very excited. They brought out every trailer. Their favorite trailers that they had worked on, trailers they wished they had done on the movies at other studios. And they started explaining to me how they sell movies. Because if you don't have this conversation, you're just going to be fighting with them later. And I didn't want to have that fight. I wanted to understand where they were coming from. And in so doing, I understood that it was always going to be a struggle if I cast the actor that I wanted, because of what they were looking to sell in internationally, domestically. And I knew I'd be fighting an uphill battle. So I said, okay, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to find an actor that is what they are looking for, so that I don't have to have that fight. Of course, that's easier said than done. And there might have been 2 actors that fit in that box, and they had since been discovered and were unavailable. And so we found an actor. she was great. She was very, very good. And we started to work with her. And at a certain point, we were kind of at the last minute, and we were being told, you've got to cast this actor today, or she won't be ready to be thrown off the Vienna rooftop on the first day of shooting when we start shooting in Vienna. That was Ilsa's first day of work was going off for her. Yeah. And this actor was phenomenal, but the tone that this actor brought to the character, where this actor was going to sing, was in something darker and more dangerous. And that wasn't the tone of the movie that we were looking for. You were always going to be trying to fit a square peg in a round hole. And everything Tom and I do is about serving the actor. And we cast an actor, we don't write a role. You find somebody who's great and you start to tailor the role around. And as I was tailoring this role, it was taking the movie in a direction that we knew it wasn't going to give us what we wanted. Never mind what marketing wanted. It wasn't going to give us the right tone. And Tom said, let's go back one more time. Let's look through every single audition that the casting director had done. And we went back, and there was one we had never looked at, and it was Rebecca Ferguson. Yeah. And in a 2.5-minute clip, we saw Ingrid Bergman. We saw what Tom and I always talk about, which is Tom's favorite movie is Notorious. I love Casablanca, and Ingrid Bergman is kind of our romantic ideal. And we said, please just let her be available. And so we pivoted and we cast Rebecca. So not only did I not cast the actor that I thought marketing wanted, who we let go, and who's gone on to do very well. We then cast an actor that marketing definitely didn't want, and yet fit the role correctly. We came full circle and said, trust us, this is going to be great. We're going to give you something. So we did our due diligence. We tried to play the game, and the movie just wouldn't let us do it. The irony is that the actor going back to the beginning, the actor that I wanted to cast before I went into that meeting was Haley Atwell. And now we've come full circle, and Haley Atwell is perfectly suited for what we're doing in Seven. Or more appropriately, Seven is perfectly suited for what Haley brings to it. The franchise wasn't ready for, or at least I wasn't as a filmmaker, to provide the role for Haley that I can provide for her now.
Yeah. We're looking forward to seeing that. And speaking about casting, I'm struck just by the casting of Henry Cavill in Fallout. And, I know you alluded to it already, and spoiler alert for anyone who hasn't seen the movie yet, but, it's the way he's defeated, not just defeated, the way he's horribly disfigured at the end, which seems like a deliberately cruel thing to do to that very handsome face, obviously. But I think it's such an interesting subversion of Cavill's image and his Superman persona. It works so well as a form of misdirection, of course. But he's talk about this. I think he's really memorable as Cruise's true, nemesis in that movie.
It's funny. That is the absolute flip side of the casting of Ilsa, which is Henry was my first choice. And I knew that there would be a lot of resistance to Superman being the villain of the movie. And so I did not submit Henry on the original list of people that I presented. What I presented was a list of really phenomenal actors who were either going to be unavailable or unaffordable, or it was a dream list that I knew from experience you were never going to get. And as you start to create more and more of these lists, I would put Henry's name at number 8, number 7, and his name would just slowly filter to the top. And I was keeping my eye on his availability. And eventually, Henry Cavill's, the name kept coming up. The concept of Henry had been discussed many times. The concerns about Superman had been digested, and I wasn't the one making the argument. I was letting everybody else just talk about it. And the whole time I was waiting to make my move. And because I had gone and met with Henry, and had a really lovely lunch with him here in London. And he's got a phenomenal sense of humor. And I knew that sense of humor meant he'd be a great villain. People ask me, how do you write a great villain? Or what is the secret to a great villain? And I always say it's casting. You can, it's writing stuff for villains to do and making villains bad. You're just chasing something. If you don't believe inherently, you don't need to write anything for Javier Bardem to be a great villain. Javier Bardem, he walks in the room with a weird haircut, and that guy's a villain. He carries himself naturally in such a way that you believe him in that role. Anything he does that is villainous is a bonus on top of the fact that he is just naturally gifted in that way. He has that it. Henry, I knew when I met him was somebody who had not been exploited to his full potential. And I also knew he was game. He was really willing to do it. So as you said, subverting that image was half the battle. That's really just having Henry show up and be a bad guy and be a very committed bad guy, kind of a ruthless one. His casting just made it that much easier. And the great thing about Henry is with Mission Impossible, again, we don't quite know who the villain is or what the villain's agenda is. What is his relation to the other villain in the movie? And Henry would come to work every day and his story would be different while we were figuring things out. And every scene you shoot changes the scenes that you're going to shoot. It has to be conformed to the scenes that you've already shot, regardless of what order you're shooting them in, which meant that Henry was just on this seesaw every day. And I would tell him, this is your character today. He'd process it all and say, can I do this and this? And I would process that and say, yep, that won't conflict with anything we've done so far. And he'd say, great, I got it. And he'd do it. So you're watching somebody who is actually coming to work every day with a different narrative for a great deal of the movie. And it wasn't really until we got closer to the end of the film that he knew that. And none of that mattered because Henry understood his character's mindset. It didn't matter what his character's reasons were. He understood the kind of character that he was. He understood his character. Reasons they're irrelevant. Reasons are why you go from Paris to Kashmir. They're not what make the characters. What make the characters is how they respond to the tests that we throw at them.
Very much comes through. Chris, I've completely lost track of time. I'm told we need to wrap up pretty soon, and I know you've been really generous with your time, but I do want to have...
I'm on lockdown, so...
all the time in the world. I do too, but unfortunately...
all that.
We could, maybe after this. But we do want to have time for one reader question, which sure. I think I'm going to put on the screen here, and it's about Tom Cruise. It's Tom Cruise played an aging action hero with humor and class. Was that something Tom brought to the character? Was it written into the script? Or did you direct him to lean into that side of his character? And it's true, I know he was, 56 or 50, I can't remember which at the time of Fallout, but he's unstoppable. But we do see this very poignant kind of acknowledgement of age setting in. Talk about that, yeah.
Look, it's contrary to what you might believe. Tom Cruise has a great sense of humor about himself, and a true awareness of the audience's awareness. We talk all the time about what the audience is bringing to the movie. We shape our stories around what's happening in the zeitgeist. What is the audience feeling? The example I use all the time is I grew up during the Cold War. You didn't need to explain the stakes of the Cold War to me when I went to see The Hunt for Red October. It was happening. It was real. And so Tom and I look at your reality and how it's influencing your emotional response to the movie as you're coming to the table. At the same time, we're trying to balance that with something timeless as opposed to topical and current. We want our movies to translate not just now, but forever. we look at Buster Keaton, and we look at those movies that have lasted as long as they have. So it's a little bit of both. It's a little bit of a dance. I will always make suggestions based on how I think the audience is perceiving the movie, and that awareness. And it's an awareness you can't escape. And so why try? Why should we even bother trying to escape? The same way that in The Usual Suspects, I didn't fool you, you did. I used the way you watch narrative to lead you down the path that I wanted to lead you. And I knew that in your trying to outsmart the movie, you would outsmart yourself. There's no difference in that narrative than there is, I know you've been looking at this guy for 35 years. You've been watching him in all of these movies, and he's a guy you think you know. I'm not going to try to change what you think you know about this guy. I'm going to use that against you to endear you to the character that he's playing. And Tom is very comfortable in that space. We play with that a lot.
You do it remarkably, and I think with Rogue Nation and Fallout, you've brought so much resurgence to a series, against considerable odds, is still going so strong, and really, really excited to see MI7, MI8, and learning what their titles are as well down the road. Thank you so much. I know.
I can't wait to find out. No, I really don't know. I really haven't the foggiest idea. We have, we have concepts about it, but I was on a scout today, and I was on a location that had absolutely no business being in a Mission Impossible movie. It was. But it had a very striking look to it. Now, whether or not we ever use that location, I suddenly realized in looking at that location, if this is in the story, why would it be in the story? And suddenly realized this is why. And a piece of the puzzle fell into place where I suddenly realized part of the villain's agenda in the story. That's the exciting part about making these movies. I'm discovering the movie at the same time Ethan Hunt is. Ethan Hunt is lost in a narrative that is bigger than him, and he's just trying to keep his team alive. That is exactly what the experience of making a Mission Impossible is, and it's the experience of watching a Mission Impossible. So I know that I'm being led through a mystery by a villain I don't know, whose agenda I don't understand, and only makes sense to him. And I'm just trying to make sense of it, which is why, I had a very strong idea of what the title would be, just as I had a very strong idea of what the beginning of the movie would be, and I have a very strong idea of what the end of the movie would be. Yeah. Then a global pandemic came, and that global pandemic has changed the way we make movies.
Of course.
So I know now that whatever I thought the movie was is not the movie. That doesn't panic me. That excites me. I go into it knowing every day I will be challenged. Not every week, not every weekend. Every day I'm going to go not knowing that tomorrow's plan will match up with today's. And all I can do every day when I go to work is try to find the emotional frame, try to find the truth in a character, and try to make sense of why these characters are moving forward in this very confused and futureless world. That's what I feel like I'm going through in real life.
Thank you so much. I'm told I need to wrap up. I'm so sorry to cut you off, but we're so excited to see all this. And I really want to quickly, before we say goodbye, I want to give our readers a quick preview of week 14. This was an excellent week. No fewer than 3 Tom Cruise movies, Risky Business, Collateral, and of course, Mission Impossible, Rogue Nation. But all of those had their fans and many others. But in the end, we came down to 3 movies, and they were The Fugitive and Babe and The Iron Giant. All 3 had their fans, but in the end, Babe and The Iron Giant split the family-friendly vote. Your winner, ladies and gentlemen, is The Fugitive, Andrew Davis's classic 93 thriller starring Harrison Ford. We will be back next Thursday to talk about The Fugitive with a special guest, hopefully as special as Christopher McQuarrie have been. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for
my pleasure.
So generous with your time and your insights. And we wish you all the best in London and just the months to come. And
thank you.
Everyone, thank you for watching. Thank you for sharing your questions. And we will bid you farewell.
I appreciate it. Thanks very much. Be well.